Second reading roll call, House Bill 347. The clerk will read.
House Bill 347, Sports Wagering, Horse Racing Wagering.
Senator Moffitt is recognized to explain the bill.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Senate, House Bill 347 allows the state of North Carolina to regulate and tax sports wagering and parimutuel betting in North Carolina. This practice is currently ongoing, but in order for us to regulate and tax, we must first authorize its practice. That's what this bill does. I ask for your support, and I'm prepared to answer any questions. Thank you.
Discussion or debate? Senator Perry, for what purpose you rise?
Send forward an amendment.
Send forward your amendment. Clerk will read.
Senator Perry moves to amend the bill.
Senator Perry is recognized to explain Amendment 1.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this amendment provides some cleanup to language. There is a combination of a determination of how to handle funds as you end one year and roll into another to make sure that the commission would have enough money on hand to pay the bills without us having to get into reversion language or allowing them to keep a large sum of money for a long period of time. There are requests in here from DOR on cleanup and authorization of some taxes, and there is cleanup on the front page making it parallel with the sports betting language for the ADW licenses. And the last big section on the back is also a DOR request for a interactive sports wagering operator to register with the secretary, and to this allows DOR to have access to information more quickly if they have any questions and to get their hands on records. So would appreciate your support for this amendment.
Discussion or debate on Amendment 1. Senator Moffitt, for what purpose you rise?
Speak on the amendment.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Perry and I have been working on this amendment, so this is an amendment that I would ask everybody to support. Thank you.
Further discussion or debate on Amendment 1. Senator Meyer, for what purpose you rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to be asked to be excused on voting from House Bill 347 under Senate Rule 29. I've turned in my paperwork to the clerk.
We do have that paperwork. Thank you. Further discussion or debate on Amendment 1. Hearing none, the question for the Senate is the adoption of Amendment 1 to House Bill 347. All in favor of the amendment will vote aye. All opposed vote no. 5 seconds be allowed for the voting. Clerk will record the vote. (47) having voted in the affirmative, 2 in the negative. Amendment 1 is adopted, and the bill is back before us. Discussion or debate on House Bill 347 on second reading. Senator Bergen, for what purpose you rise?
Speak to the bill.
You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I've been told that floor speeches don't matter much, that everyone's already made up their mind. I hope that's not true. If it is, then we should never waste our time on debate. We should only come on the floor to vote or just vote remotely. A few things that concern me about this bill are $7.2 billion total betting in the 5th year. That's not new money coming into the state. That's money that's currently in the state being spent on things like kids and food and rent. It's just money being reallocated. It's been said that there's already $1 billion being illegally bet. Well, why don't we tax that? We show in the bill that we can do that through geofencing and other ways. This bill generates $100 million to the state in the 5th year, with over $600 million going to the people that are going to be administering the bill, or the bets. This is some of the things that people have said to me about this bill. And some of my other, let me go through some more concerns first. It allows family members to bet on their children, siblings, or others that they may have influence. It allows micro betting on components of the game. This is what some of the people have said about the bill. It is a tax built on the exploration of others, taking advantage of poor people who think they can gain instant wealth. People lose their homes, spouses, and kids over gambling addiction. Gambling can be just as addictive as drugs and alcohol. Teens and their parents need to know that they're not just gambling with money, they're gambling with their very lives. And the last is, gambling is a sure way of getting nothing for something. I got a call a couple of weeks ago from a friend, and he's a client of mine. He said his girlfriend has used his debit card to do online betting and lost $25,000 of his money. Was there any harm done? Well, we had the loss of a relationship, potential criminal charges, the loss of his wealth, and I don't think any of those things can ever be repaired. C.H. Spurgeon once said, "The soldiers at the foot of the cross threw dice for my Savior's garments. And I've never heard the rattling of dice, but I've conjured up the dreadful scene of Christ on his cross, gamblers at the foot of it with the dice spattered with his blood. I do not hesitate to say that for all sins there is none that more surely damns men, and worse than that, makes them the devil's helpers to damn others than gambling." Now, I'm not a prophet, but I'll make a prediction today. We'll look back on this bill, and each of us will have an instance where something will happen, and we will say, was that the direct effect of what we voted on today? There was an article this morning that I read that said that a third of all college, this was a Gallup poll, a third of all college students have thought about dropping out of school, primarily because of stress, depression, and I attribute a lot of that to not just gambling or any of that, but social media and all the things that they're exposed to now. And there's also a trend among young people to not get smartphones, to go back to just a basic phone, and I think that's a good thing for them. The last test I apply to any decision I make is called the Catherine Bergen test. And that test is, will it disappoint my mother?
Further discussion or debate? Senator Mayfield, for what purpose you rise?
Speak on the bill.
You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. So we disagree on a lot of things in this chamber, but there are a couple of things that we agree on. And one of those is the dual mental health addiction crisis that we see in so many people across our state, particularly in young people, but certainly not exclusively. And my very strong feeling and fear is that this bill takes us in the wrong direction on this issue. So this bill legalizes an activity that is recognized as an addiction on the same level as heroin, cocaine, and opioids. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM-5, includes gambling disorder as the only non-substance addictive disorder endorsed as a diagnosis. The APA website states that in the DSM-5, gambling disorder has been placed in a new category on behavioral addictions. This reflects research findings showing that gambling disorder is similar to substance-related disorders in clinical expression, brain origin, comorbidity, physiology, and treatment. So again, gambling is the only addictive disorder that is based on behavior and not an outside substance. If we could go back and put stricter guardrails on the use of opioids, we certainly would. If we could go back and reduce access to tobacco and save all the lives that have been lost to cancer, we probably would. And we're not even considering in North Carolina legalizing heroin, cocaine, or even recreational marijuana. Gambling is already available in North Carolina with guardrails. You have to physically go somewhere to gamble. It's only available in a limited number of places. And I'm afraid that in a decade that we will regret removing the guardrails that we are proposing to do today. Increased availability of gambling leads to an increased risk of developing a gambling disorder. For instance, living in a town with a casino leads to an increased risk of developing a gambling disorder. And we are now talking about putting a casino in everybody's pocket that they can access 24/7, 365. Now, you will say that the vast majority of people who gamble do so responsibly, and you would be right. But the gambling industry doesn't make its money off of those people. Indeed, those folks represent only about 4% of gambling revenues. The problem gamblers, on the other hand, generate up to 60% of gambling revenues. So the profitability of the industry, indeed their entire business model, is based on getting people addicted to this activity. Even with the promised revenue of this bill, it is beyond me why we would legalize a business model that succeeds only when individuals fail. I know that those of us opposed to introducing online sports betting today may lose the vote. But again, I fear that we will be back here in a few years looking to stem the harmful tide that we are about to unleash, just as so many other states have had to do in the last couple of years. In closing, I will say that I don't know who sent out an action alert on this bill several weeks ago or who their email target audience was, but I thought it was telling that a lot of the emails I got had an address of a homeless day center in Asheville. This is a place where homeless people can go to shower, wash clothes, get their medications, get their mail. They use that address as their home address, and that's okay. But the people who frequent this day center and use it as their home address are people who are already in mental crisis and most of whom already are suffering from addiction. It is not surprising, although it is sad and telling, that this audience and people who took time to send me an email about this, granted a form email, but an email nonetheless, that this audience craves yet another activity that they cannot afford and that will contribute to the ruin of their lives. Yet that is where we propose to go today. I ask you to vote against this bill. Thank you.
Further discussion or debate? Senator Grafstein, for what purpose you rise?
To speak to the bill?
You have the floor.
Thank you. Mr. President, members, I want to talk about the context of this bill because I think it really matters a lot. This bill, a lot of people are talking about it as legalizing sports betting, but it's actually not what it does. It really just provides a monopoly to some large-scale gambling operations that operate nationally. And it just creates a large-scale way for those organizations to use sophisticated technology to entice people to bet and then bet again and then bet some more. And that context, I think, is important as we think about winners and losers with this bill, because as we all know, the House always wins. A central argument in favor of the bill is that it creates regulation of something that is currently unregulated. And I think the notion of that is a little bit, I guess, comical, because it's as if the industry showed up and turned itself in for regulation. And I think we all know that's not really what industries do. But the numbers also don't support that as a notion, the idea that we're now just going to regulate something that's been previously unregulated. By the industry's own figures, we're looking at a massive expansion of gambling. I've heard the numbers this week of over $1 billion in illegal sports betting happening right now, and I'm not really, honestly, entirely sure where that number comes from. But even assuming it's 100% accurate that is happening at that level, it really just shows that the level of gambling is about to balloon if we pass this bill. Industry and staff projections are that, as Senator Bergen said, that we will see over $7 billion in bets placed annually. And it's also just common sense that gambling is going to increase when it's more readily available to people. Right now, it's only those who are really specifically motivated and have the technological savvy who are able to bet illegally. And once ads are everywhere, and there's an easy way for even the most technologically unsophisticated among us, such as myself, to bet on our phones, those numbers are just going to skyrocket. So the argument that we're regulating what's already happening is really not accurate, I would say, and we would be creating more gambling. The other problem is that the bill doesn't actually regulate the industry in the meaningful way I think we all think about when we think about regulation. And here I've got a few examples from the bill. The commission that's created is specifically forbidden from setting parameters around minimum or maximum payouts or bets. There's no limit to how skewed the odds can be. The bill says that the operator is supposed to protect private data, including financial data, and to disallow ineligible players, which of course means people underage. But the standard that is applied is, quote, commercially reasonable effort, unquote, for doing those things and for detecting suspicious or illegal wagering. So under the terms of the bill itself, you don't actually have to prevent those things. And you get to police yourself by whatever you deem to be commercially reasonable efforts. And of course, you know, there are a specific number of these folks, these industries, or these operators throughout the country. They are the industry. So what's commercially reasonable is kind of what they say it is. There's also no criminal liability. There's a small penalty for operators to violate some of these rules, but there's no criminal liability for the operator unless they actually know, they have actual knowledge, for example, that the person was underage when they bet. But kids who are under 21 face a Class 2 misdemeanor if they are found to have been betting illegally, and that's because the house always wins. The bulk of the application for the license is not a public record. That's not a great sign for accountability. There's a sort of a black box of information that the public won't know about the projected revenues and other components of the application, information that's presumably important enough to ask for. And beyond just sort of the laxness of the oversight provided for, this bill would impose gambling even where people don't want it. A lot of people in our state don't want to see gambling. But what the bill says is that if a governing body of a sport does not want their sport to be the subject of the gambling, if the ACC decided we don't want gambling on our sport, or a high school team decided they didn't want gambling on their sport, they would have the burden of proving that gambling may undermine the integrity of their sporting events. They can't just say no. We don't want people betting on our sport. As we've seen in other states and countries, gambling becomes central to sporting events. From odds making on television to in-game ads to micro-betting. You know, what are the consequences of that? In finance yesterday, we learned that to generate that projected revenue that we were talking about, the profit for the corporations, again, was $500 to $600 million. That's over $500 million leaving the pockets of people in this state and leaving our economy in perpetuity every year. But it's actually much more than that, because to generate that type of profit, people will actually be betting over $7 billion a year. And those are dollars, as Senator Bergen again referenced, that people aren't spending on other things, that we would be taxing on the dollar, not on the profit. So the revenue projections really kind of ignore the costs that are being, or the lost revenue potential, and they also ignore the local economic impacts. This bill brings to mind, if you'll go back in time with me, a book about the collapse of Enron. If those of us who remember Enron, you remember they were the energy sector giant that seemed to have figured out some clever, genius, foolproof way of making money in the energy sector. The book was called The Smartest Guys in the Room, and the title sort of sums up the book. The Enron guys put together a complex scheme that nobody really understood how they were making the money. And they presented it as if they knew what they were doing, and they were convincing and sharp and well-dressed, all that sort of thing. So much so that people were reluctant to admit that they didn't really understand, or they were silent about it because it seemed like everyone else understood what these guys were talking about. And you know, that included the regulators who were duped. And that's no different, though. What happened with Enron was no different than many ways clever people have used to separate people from their money. And it's not the fault of the people who are tricked, particularly in the case of online gambling, which is literally just designed to manipulate people using sophisticated technology that I suspect none of us really understand. I will admit I don't understand it. The algorithms that are at the heart of what is being sold here, what the operators use, it's a black box. We have no visibility into it. We can't look inside. We don't know. What we do know is that the apps on our phones and the careful targeting on all devices that we use, they're used to manipulate us into certain behaviors, and it works. There's always been advertising. You get thirsty 5 minutes after you see the Coke billboard, but this is at a level where the enticements are constant and micro-targeted, and the consequences are deeply damaging. And we have no idea how to stop them from doing what they are plainly planning to do. We know, and the studies show, that people engage with their phones too much, Senator Murdoch, And it's, it's a constant source of distraction and a means of immediately quieting the boredom. Young people turn to their phones for constant interaction or validation, and we don't want to think about what else. And I appreciate really very much the comments about what phones do to our kids and the mental health crisis. And I really appreciate Senator Moffitt yesterday, just honestly acknowledging the trade-offs in a bill like this, that there are going to be harms in it, and that we know there's going to be more gambling addiction, and then we're just kind of trying to make a choice about these things. And we're choosing differently. Some of us are just choosing differently, but we know it's going to happen. Bloomberg did a study, not the little guy, but Bloomberg News, did a study of the legalized and regulated gambling system in the UK. And they've had sort of this kind of system of legalized gambling for 15 years. They found that 60% of the profits came from the top 5% of users. And that just shows, I think this is what Senator Mayfield was getting at, the deep effects of gambling addiction. That estimate included 36,000 children. The government in that study estimated that 8% of suicides were gambling related. It's the problem gamblers who account for the profit that we're also eager to tax. And I want to just say briefly about the revenue piece of it. I think it's a reason a lot of folks are supporting this bill. The revenue piece of it is premised on a 18% tax on the profits to these operators, and there has been analysis to suggest that that's an unconstitutional tax. And so what we could end up with this bill is that tax being found unconstitutional, and the revenues that we were all counting on to pay for a lot of the things that are in the bill, that those revenues go away. But really beyond that, the next phase, if we authorize online gambling, is the introduction of online casinos. Again, to Senator Mayfield's point, that includes, online casinos include slot machines and other games you find at casinos. The industry calls this iGaming, because I guess it sounds cooler. The CEO of one sports betting operator told lawmakers at a conference, "It's time for your state to add iGaming, not in the future, but now." So this is the push that we will see coming, and there's no end of the clever new ways that people will get addicted to damaging gaming online. So finally, the bill reminds me of another book, Ecclesiastes, or Kohelet, for those who like the Hebrew, like my friend, I think still my friend, Senator Lowe. There's nothing new under the sun. Online gambling is just the latest means of extracting dollars out of pockets. It's just flashier. It's a means for an industry to make money in ways that are just exponentially more sophisticated and frankly beyond our ability to control, because the House always wins. So I'll be voting no, and I would appreciate you all considering, even if you came in planning to vote yes, voting no. Thank you.
Further discussion or debate? Hearing none, question for the Senate is the passage on second reading of the Senate Committee Substitute to House Bill 347. All in favor will vote aye. All opposed will vote no. 5 seconds be allowed for the voting. Clerk will record the vote. "38 having voted in the affirmative, 11 in the negative. House Bill 347 is passed its second reading and will remain on the calendar. Members, that completes our calendar. Are there any notices or announcements?